We've got so many friggin' options to choose from right now in terms of, PC parts. Do you go with the newest Intel or AMD platform? Do you go with an older platform? Same with graphics cards. Do you buy a shiny new GPU that just came out, or do you go with one of the older ones that have come way down in price? We're gonna talk about that today, and I've actually assembled a full parts list that I spent a lot of time on. I think it's a really good build. It's gonna range anywhere between $1,700 and $1,800. I've got a couple different options for some of the components that you guys can choose between, and that'll sort of change or make the pricing fluctuate a bit. But overall, you're looking at around a sub $1,800 build today. So stick around for that, right after a word from our sponsor.
Before we continue, special thanks to Kioxia for sponsoring this video. Kioxia's latest NVMe SSDs offer improved performance, reliability, and capacity, like the XG8 series built for gamers and power users. The PCIe Gen 4 M.2 drive delivers sequential read and write speeds up to 7,000 and 5,800 megabytes a second, with up to a 4 terabyte capacity to store the ultimate game library. Kioxia's 5th generation BICS Flash 3D flash memory also makes the XG8 suitable for professional video production and applications requiring high-speed access to high-cap data, making it a prime choice for workstations and high-end PCs. The Kioxia CD8 series fulfills rigorous data center needs. Designed to NVMe 1.4 and PCIe Gen 5 specifications, the 2.5-inch drive features a single-port design optimized for server-attached hyperscale and general server workloads, while 7th-gen flash die failure protection maintains full reliability in the event of die failure. Experience leading performance with 7.2 gigabytes a second of maximum sequential throughput, while being backed by fail-safe technologies like power loss protection and end-to-end data protection. Designed for hyperscale data center environments, the XD7P series uses the E1.S form factor with breakthrough thermal and performance benefits, meeting the form factor, power, and thermal requirements of the OCP Data Center NVMe SSD v2.0 specification. The PCIe Gen 5 drive sustains optimal performance and reliability in demanding 24/7 data center environments and features up to twice the performance of the previous generation. For more info on Kioxia SSDs, check out the links in the description below.
So the first question I asked myself when putting together this parts list was, do I go AMD or Intel? I think if you're building a new system, you want to invest in a new platform, in the current gen platform. Going AM4 at this point doesn't really make much sense. It'd be different if you already had an existing build. Let's say you already had an AM4 build. The value proposition of going Ryzen 7000 series to going AM5 is not as good because you have to upgrade the motherboard. You have to upgrade the RAM as well, going from DDR4 to DDR5, and it just gets a lot more costly as opposed to if you were to build a completely new system from scratch. On the flip side, if you already have an LGA 1700 system from Intel, you could upgrade to a 13th gen Raptor Lake CPU, but then how much longer is that socket going to be available for? If you're looking at Intel, like the way Intel has done things for a really long time is they usually have 2 CPUs per socket. They swap out their sockets every other generation. And right now, like 13th gen is the second CPU that's been on LGA 1700. So from that logic, by next year, they're gonna be moving on to a new socket. And if you want to upgrade your processor a couple of years from now, you're gonna have to upgrade your motherboard and all that stuff as well. And since we're looking at this from the standpoint of building a new system, I think it makes the most sense to me, in my opinion, to go with AM5. Just because AMD has promised that they're gonna continue AM5 up until at least 2025. So it could potentially last even longer than that. And of course, you always have to consider the fact that a manufacturer may not hold true to their word. Like they could go with AM6, before 2005 hits, but assuming that AMD keeps their word and that doesn't happen, you have a lot more longevity on AM5 than you do with LGA 1700, most likely. So with that in mind, I've gone with the Ryzen 5 7600X, and this is going to be purely a gaming build. 7600X is a beast of a gaming CPU. It's competitive with, 7900X, it's competitive with a Core i5 13700K, and it's a 6-core 12-thread chip. If you are going to be using the system for content creation, heavy content creation, streaming, rendering, video editing, that sort of thing, then you're probably going to want to bump up to at least a Ryzen 7 7700X. I would say this is a really good starting off point for today's build. It's a $300 CPU at the moment. Of course, these new Ryzen 7000 series chips do not include coolers. There's no more, they've done away with the Wraith coolers for this generation. So we're going to go with an aftermarket one, like this Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 280mm AIO. These are really great coolers. The Arctic Liquid Freezer 2s are a great value. They're a lot cheaper than a lot of comparable AIOs out there, but they perform just as well, if not better than a lot of them. The fans are super quiet, so you can even crank up the fan speed a bit if you want additional cooling without sacrificing much in the way of noise. And there's no RGB on this, so this is actually going to be, I've spec'd this out to be a completely blacked out build for the most part. There's a little bit of, there's going to be some RGB on the GPU, but you can always turn that off. Doing away with RGB entirely, it can save you some money, and a fully blacked out build just never goes out of style. It's always going to look good, and personally I think it just looks a bit more mean when there's like no lighting. This is a really great cooler. I went with 280 because it's sort of the stopgap between 240 and 360. This is plenty of cooling for the 7600X. It's probably still going to spike up to, what is it, 95C under load, but that's normal for this generation. That's by design. And I think this also gives you some additional thermal headroom if you were to upgrade your CPU down the line. And that takes us to our motherboard, which is kind of a tricky situation. What AMD's done with this generation between all the 4 different chipsets that you're looking at, B650, B650E, and X670 and X670E, it gets a little murky. I'm gonna go with B650E, which is gonna support Gen 5, PCIe Gen 5 on both the graphics slot as well as your M.2 slot. And while we don't really have PCIe Gen 5 devices yet, this is gonna provide that forward compatibility so that you're not really leaving any performance on the table. Now, it's not a huge deal, I think, if you went with something like a B650 non-E board. That's gonna save you, what, 60 bucks here, but you're not gonna get that Gen 5 support on the graphics slot, which may not be a big deal for some people. Because right now, if you look at all the testing that's been done already on Gen 3 versus Gen 4, in the vast majority of cases, whether you're talking about compute or gaming performance, there's a very little difference. It's very marginal, practically meaningless. But there are still a lot of people out there who just, if you want that peace of mind, I don't fault anyone. I'm actually among this group of just having that peace of mind, knowing that you're not leaving any performance on the table, even if it is, just a couple percentage points. This is actually a good time to poll you guys. Do you think it's worth going for the slightly more expensive board to get Gen 5 support, or would you rather save the money on one that only has Gen 4? Assuming that you're going to have this build for the next 4 or 5 years, do you feel like you're going to have like FOMO, once a Gen 5 GPU finally comes out, or is it really kind of more a novelty? You guys let me know. PCIe specification aside though, I think either of these boards would work just fine. 14 power stages, 8+4 pin for your EPS. I believe this is the same. Yeah, that's 8+4 as well. For memory, I went with a G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo series. This is a 32 gig kit, so 2 16 gig sticks. That'll give you expansion options for up to 64 gigs of memory should you need it in the future. DDR5 6000 speed. This was the most affordable 6000 speed DDR5 kit I could find between Amazon and Newegg. All the pages that you see, all the prices here is the cheapest between the two of those two sites. So this is 185, 186, and this kit supports AMD Expo. So that's AMD's latest technology for AM5 that is pretty much their equivalent to Intel XMP. It allows you to really quickly overclock your memory within the BIOS with a single click. If you didn't have AMD Expo, that's not a huge deal. All of the existing XMP memory kits that have been on the market for ages will still work with AM5. You're just gonna have to spend a little bit more time in the BIOS configuring your settings because, as we all know, most of us know by now, your memory isn't gonna run at the rated speeds that's printed on the box, right? It's not, when you put these sticks in, it's not gonna run at 6,000 by default, which is why you have to manually configure it in the BIOS, or in some cases you can do it in the operating system, but that's what AMD Expo helps with here. With that said, moving on to graphics cards, this is a tricky one. Now, obviously I'm not gonna go with a current gen graphics card because with our budget of sub $1,800, throwing in a $1,200 RTX 4080 or something like that wouldn't really leave us much room for anything else. Even if you went with like a RX 7900 XT from AMD, which has an MSRP of $899, as we all know by now, graphics cards aren't really selling for MSRP when they launch. Because like look at 4090s right now. 4090s MSRP is $1,600. None of them are going for less than $2,100. For our budget at hand today, it makes a lot more sense. The only viable option is to go with an older generation card. That still leaves the question, do you go AMD or NVIDIA? Fortunately, prices have dropped significantly on the last generation of graphics cards for both brands. So you kind of have your pick of the litter here. With the RTX 3080, this is the cheapest 3080 that I could find that's brand new. It's this Zotac Trinity OC model, and it's going for around $733, but it gets even cheaper if you're willing to go with a secondhand card. So on eBay right now, you can get a 3080 for $500. Obviously it's pre-owned, but if you're okay with that and the associated risks attached to it, you can get a 3080 for what a 3070 was MSRPing for at the worst dip of the GPU shortage, the chip shortage, and all the crypto crap, a 3070 wasn't going for less than $800, sometimes $900, and now we're getting a 3080 for $500. So you have to be okay with buying secondhand though. I wanted to throw that option out there though, because I mean, you're saving $230 if you're willing to make that compromise. And I should probably explain why a 3080 and not a 3080 Ti or a 3070. 3080 Ti's and 3090s are still going for a bit more than what today's budget really allows for. You could squeeze it in, but then you'd have to make some compromises elsewhere. But I also think that 3080 is a really solid card for entry-level 4K, but more specifically 1440p high refresh gaming, which seems to be the sweet spot for a lot of gamers right now. On the AMD side, we have the 3080 equivalent, which is the RX 6800 XT. But you can see here, for a brand new one, this is the cheapest 6800 XT at the time of filming, you're getting it for around the same price as you would a used RTX 3080. So this is another thing I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on in the comments. Would you go with a brand new 6800 XT, or would you rather have a used RTX 3080? Assuming that they're the same price and the same performance. The reason why I think this is a tough decision is because obviously I would want the new card to have that manufacturer's warranty guarantee and the return policy option, but I also kind of like the idea of having better ray tracing performance on the NVIDIA side and other technologies from NVIDIA like NV Encoder. I think that this can be really useful. You guys may have a different opinion, so sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear which of these two options you would choose. For storage, WD Black SN770. Sorry, my voice is a little scratchy. I'm getting over a cold. But this is an NVMe drive PCIe Gen 4, and I think this is a really good bang for the buck option. It's really solid performance, sequential reads of 5150 megabytes a second. 2 terabytes is the minimum I would personally suggest for a gaming system these days. Game files are just getting absurdly large. You know, like you're seeing game installs go up to 200, 250 gigs. It's absolutely insane. So 1 terabyte doesn't really get you the mileage that it used to. One option you could go with if you wanted to save some coin up front is by buying a 1 terabyte drive. You just have to be okay with expanding that down the line once you run out of space, inevitably run out of space. But moving on to power supply, we have the Asus ROG Strix 850 watt. This is a gold rated unit. I think this is good because even if you did want to upgrade to, let's say, a 4090 2-3 years from now, an 850 watt unit would still suffice. If you really wanted to future proof and you wanted that peace of mind, you could go with a 1000 watt unit in the unfortunate event that the next generation of graphics cards require, 1000 watts for their flagship designs. But for this particular build, if we're not talking about future proofing, with the CPU and GPU that we have in here, 850 watts is perfectly adequate. And then our case, there's so many good case options. This is just one of many good chassis choices out there right now. The Corsair 4000D Airflow, it's one of the higher quality cases that I've come across for this price point of around $100. Cable management is good, the airflow is fantastic, good radiator mounting support, and it does include 2 120mm fans. Another viable case option that I'll put on your radar that goes for around the same price is the Fantex Eclipse G360A. This comes included with 3 fans and they're RGB. This kind of takes away from our blacked out theme, but if you want RGB, you can do 360 at the top or the front, whereas on the 4000D, you can only put a 360 at the front. Although for 280mm radiators, you can only put a 280 rad at the front of this case, whereas you can put a 280 at the front or the top of the 4000D. So they kind of, go tit for tat in that regard. One thing I do like about the 4000D though, it's got a USB-C on the front panel. It's got 1 type A and 1 type C, whereas you only get 2 type A's on the front of the G360A. And I think, our USB-C usage these days is just in full swing. I have tons of USB-C devices, you do too probably, and so it's just kind of nice to have that on the front. I have to throw this in there just because it's a legendary case, but the O11D, if you're gonna go for a splurge option, this is enough case to last you almost a lifetime, I would say. And for what it's worth, if you care at all about aesthetics, it's just a beautiful case, but it is about $50 more than the other case options we were looking at, but just had to throw that out there. So those are all the parts though. I think in total, if you went with whether you went with like a new 6800 XT or a used RTX 3080 for around $540, $550, and you went with the 4000D Airflow, you'd be looking at a total price of $1,769. And that's also assuming that you went with the B650E motherboard with that latest PCIe Gen 5 support on the graphics slot. But I hope you guys found this list helpful. I really sort of went into it from the perspective of like, okay, if one of my friends or one of you came up to me and asked me like, hey Kyle, like I've got this much money to spend on a brand new build, what should I get? There's so many options. This is sort of like me sharing my thought process with you in terms of like what I think makes sense right now. And obviously, it's personal preference. If you want to go with an Intel CPU, Raptor Lake is fantastic. Whether you go AMD or NVIDIA, pros and cons to both. They're both great cards. So this is really just sort of, one guy's opinion on putting together a parts list here in late 2022. And sorry to anyone who's salty that I didn't use current gen graphics cards in this list. If I did, I mean, that would skyrocket the budget to $2,500, $3,000 plus, which really alienates a lot more people because it's just way out of most people's budgets. I just wanted this to be sensible and somewhat affordable. But if you guys would like to see me do a parts list that's just balls to the wall crazy with the latest generation of graphics cards, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to do that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching this one. If you enjoyed it, please toss a like on it before you go. It helps me a lot. And get subscribed for more tech content coming at you really soon. Till next time, guys, have a good one. I'll see y'all in the next video.